Hurricane Ida was the latest storm to batter New Orleans, forcing some in the region to rebuild yet again. Now, Black-led community organizations are breaking ground on green infrastructure projects to combat severe flooding. The groups are also highlighting the economic benefits of investing in sustainable infrastructure in areas most affected by climate change. Joining me now is one of those community organizers, Angela Chalk. She is the executive director of Healthy Community Services, a nonprofit that promotes green infrastructure to help with stormwater management. Angela, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Why do you see the issues of severe flooding in New Orleans as such a pressing one for communities of color?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. The issue is pressing because people who live in African American communities are disproportionately affected by the repetitive flooding. We live in a city that's 300 years old, and the great infrastructure, as we know it, the pumps, pipes, and drains, are aged. And so using nature-based solutions help us to reduce flooding in our communities. And it also allows the community to become involved in making decisions. I like to say that we're doing things with the community and for the community. And I live in a community, and all of us who are leading organizations live in the communities in which we serve.
And so talk about that a bit more. What are you trying to do to mobilize action to combat the impacts of climate change?
We want decision makers, elected officials, and policymakers to understand that these impacts are real to us. We're the ones who impacted first, and it takes us longer to bounce back from these effects. And currently, flooding is not an issue. Urban flooding is not an issue that FEMA issues reports on, and so we need nature-based solutions to both help preserve our coastal resiliency as well as, again, to mitigate against the flooding that occurs in communities of color disproportionately. The other thing is that as the infrastructure bill is pending in Congress, there are real consequences to those issues right now that affect us. And so we're looking for community organizations to partner with government, because we know our communities the best in order to help resolve the issues that we're having. And so we're looking for our government officials and government agencies to work with community organizations to fund the projects that we're looking at funding. It has an economic impact annually of up to $383 million just here in the New Orleans area alone. And so communities can lead these types of interventions by working with government. And we need those policy makers and decision makers to hear us, work with us, and not do it to us.
You know, Angela, I think some people listening might wonder, when you talk about nature-based solutions, what does that mean exactly? Because they may understand infrastructure and think about the things like, roads and bridges and pipes and drains. But what exactly is green infrastructure? When you use that term, what are you talking about specifically?
We're talking about using mechanisms or interventions such as bioswales, which is a linear channel that can store water, or rain gardens that can store water. It holds the water back. It can either detain the water or retain the water. And what you're looking at on the screen is a rain garden. And so that water it captures water, it infiltrates into the ground. And so that water never reaches the drainage system because it goes back into the ground. And again, we're reducing what's called the time of concentration for rain to get into the storm drain system. And what aids in those types of interventions are using native plants. So here in Louisiana, we have native plants that are conducive to the environment that helps aid in that. Other interventions could be permeable pavers that also will retain the water and reduce what we call that time of concentration, so that water does not get into the storm system, overwhelming it. And that's what happens when we have these frequent and intense rainfalls. The systems become overwhelmed, and we see it not only here in New Orleans, but in areas of Tennessee, New York. So it's not just a Southeast Louisiana issue. This is a national issue that's occurring, and we need to pay attention to it. And there are things that we can do by using these nature-based solutions.
Yeah, it's interesting, Angela, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how Ida and the remnants of Ida so devastated this area, the tri-state area, where we saw flooding that caused the deaths of dozens of people. And this is something that really took the tri-state area by surprise. We saw areas of New York City that were inundated, areas in New Jersey that were certainly inundated. And so I wonder if you could talk about that a bit more. What are some of those lessons? You touched on it a moment ago, but what are some of those lessons you think that you're learning in New Orleans that can be sort of effectively, transported to the or effectively used in other parts of the country where we know they are also experiencing the effects of climate change?
Again, that goes back to modernizing our policies. We need to modernize our policies because climate is changing. And in most communities, there aren't policies that address green infrastructure. And so when the flooding occurred in the tri-state area, those of us who live in this area knew exactly how the people were feeling. It plays a role on one's mental health. It's a public health issue as well when we have to keep going through repetitive floodings year after year after year, and they're getting worse. And so what I would advise residents in those communities to do is to become involved, gain the knowledge that we've built using the Waterwise Gulf South model, where we gather community residents together and start to make that change on your own, and call upon our elected officials and decision makers to help us to change those policies. Again, for instance, with FEMA requires one to build back our communities and municipalities to build back to the standard that was before the event. But we need to be thinking about the future because these events are costly not only to the individual personally, but for insurance companies. And so we need to be wiser and smarter and build back better. We have the technology, we have the knowledge to be able to build better and stronger. And we also need to have FEMA to look at policies for these urban floods that occur to be able to declare that not a disaster, but an incident, and somehow measure the impact that those incidents have on communities.
Well, certainly, as we have been seeing these extreme weather events occurring more often in parts of the country, a lot of folks are going to be very interested in seeing what solutions and potential solutions exist. Angela Chalk, Angela, thanks very much for sharing your perspective with us.
Thank you so much for having me.